Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get going with our keynote. Thank you so much for coming. It looks like private equity is alive and well in Hawaii. So we have a great program for you today. And you know, there's a mug, coffee holders and various things in front. I want to thank Orrick Harrington and Glenn Van Lichten for being our lead sponsor today, as well as HSDC, John Chalk is here, I believe, and Circle Pacific for being sponsors. We've done this for 3 years, and it's been great partnering with them. I'd like to introduce Glenn Van Lichten. He's a partner at Orrick Harrington. He was one of the first, he was actually the second partner from Venture Law Group that took an interest in Hawaii. And this was probably about 5 to 7 years ago when, you know, hardly anyone was paying attention to Hawaii. So I really feel good about what Glenn's done for Hawaii. He's put a lot of effort in. He's now at his 4th law firm, I believe, but he's still paying attention to Hawaii. Venture Law Group got acquired by Heller Ehrman, and now a bunch of his folks are at Orrick Harrington, which are, they're focusing a lot on emerging companies. So I'd like to introduce Glenn, and he's going to speak on behalf of Orrick and introduce Craig. Glenn?
Thanks, Greg. I think it's 4 law firms. It could be 5, but it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Craig. And I say Craig, just not Craig Johnson, but Craig, because in Silicon Valley, you know, Craig is one of those folks that's known by his first name. You know, there's Kobe, there's Oprah, you know, Madonna, Tiger, and there's Craig. Craig, like Hawaii's very own Greg Kim, matriculated at Yale, and then went to Stanford Law School, and then did a stint in the Peace Corps before he joined Wilson Sonsini, which back when Craig joined Wilson was, you know, maybe 20 lawyers at Wilson, and there was probably as many orchards in Silicon Valley in those days as there were technology companies. And Craig has had a active role in helping start and advise some of the most prominent companies that we know, and those would include Yahoo, that would include PayPal, Collagen, Stratacom, which at the time it was sold to Cisco, was the largest private company sale to a public company, among others. And Craig probably doesn't remember this, but I first, I'd say met Craig, but saw Craig when I was a second-year associate at my second law firm, Brother Clayer and Harrison, and we had an organizational meeting for the IPO of a company called Target Therapeutics. And Target was a pioneer in the medical device field. And it was the organizational meeting for an IPO is one where there's a bunch of bankers and accountants and lawyers in a room, everyone trying to act really self-important about what they're doing. There's always bustling. And as a junior lawyer, you were told, don't ever sit at the table. Always sit in the back. The chairs around the room, which I did, like a good junior associate. And I just noticed that, you know, there was this one person in the room, and he wasn't really looking at the public offering documents, wasn't in the mix of that, and didn't say all that much. But when he did say something, everybody sort of turned and listened. And in going back to the old E.F. Hutton commercials, you know, when E.F. Hutton talks, so I thought, wow. And then I asked somebody, well, who was that? I assumed it was the CEO of the company, and someone said, no, it's Craig Johnson. He's the company's lawyer. And I thought, wow, you know, that's something that I would want to aspire to is to be in that position and be the company's lawyer. So Craig's and my path intersected again at Venture Law Group, and Craig is a true visionary, which I think it's why it's so appropriate for him to speak here today. And Craig's vision was to create a law firm that was different. And Venture Law Group, which was Craig's creation, which was Craig's startup, because in addition to being a visionary and a lawyer, Craig really is an entrepreneur. And that law firm was different in a number of different ways. One, the firm focused and worked collaboratively with entrepreneurs and founders of companies in a manner that was different. And I think Craig also challenged lawyers to think differently about themselves. You know, we were not merely socket wrenches. We were, in effect, the entrepreneurs behind the entrepreneurs. So if you think back to 1993 when Venture Law Group was created, lawyers everywhere, including Silicon Valley, wore suits and ties every day to work. You had the occasional casual Friday, but that was your suit without the tie. And Venture Law Group, everyone dressed casually every day. Now today, at Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, most of our associates and lawyers wear jeans to work every day. And that is a direct descendant from what Craig started at Venture Law Group. So in addition to that, I think one of the things that Craig created was just institution building. I'm a fan of the book Built to Last, and I think some of the things you may think about for Built to Last are the genius of the and versus the tyranny of the or, and what's your BHAG. But I think one part of Built to Last that probably folks don't remember was the authors asked the question, if you were building a company and that company would tell time, what would you rather do? Would you rather hire somebody who could look up at the sun and the sky and then at any point in time tell you what time it was, or would you rather build a watch or build a clock? And the point was, well, you want to build a watch or the clock because that's an enduring institution. And I think what Craig built at Venture Law Group, which again I think is a lesson for all companies to learn, was an institution. And there was in terms of how Craig shared his relationships and what he was doing, and was focused on arming new generations of lawyers with careers and with a purpose, much like a great company must do. And so Craig's legacy lives on in generations of lawyers in Silicon Valley. My entire group, our entire group at Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe consists of Craig's proteges. We often sit around the office and say, if it hadn't been for Craig, who knows what we would have been doing. So I think there's a lot that Craig can tell us today that is directly applicable to entrepreneurs, investors, and otherwise. So with much ado, Craig.
Well, that was a little over the top. But thank you, Glenn. And it's fun for me to be here because I've been watching entrepreneurship in Hawaii develop in the technology area for a number of years, and I'm honored to be here today because I'm feeling like I'm with some of the godfathers of high technology innovation here. I mean, people like Barry Weinman and Bill Richardson and Deborah and all others. I mean, this is a community that's been growing in Hawaii with a lot of effort. And I think the effort is starting to really bear fruit. I mean, you can see it in this room and in the conversations that I had with people before this talk. I mean, it's just fun to see entrepreneurship bloom. And I think that's a big part of what I'm going to talk about because my basic theme today will be, what I would look for, not necessarily as a lawyer, but what if I were a seed investor, which I have been for the last 30 years in Silicon Valley. What do I look for when I invest in companies and in startups? Well, one of the first things I look for is whether I can have fun. And that may seem somewhat strange, contrarian, but for me, it's not all about making money. I mean, making money is nice, but it's really more the joy as an angel investor, as an active participant in a company, and that was also true when I was a lawyer for the companies, of creating something meaningful. Now, in Hawaii, you have unbelievable incentives for early stage investments. I mean, Act 221, oh my God. I mean, would that only be present in California? But frankly, getting your money back right away as a tax credit is, I was telling Greg Kim this in the past, it's a little bit like kissing your sister. I mean, it's kind of like you want to win. You like to build something that's meaningful. You'd like to build an institution. And if you're having fun, it's a great indication that you're on the right track. If the team is having fun, you're having fun. If you're not having fun, something is seriously wrong. It's like pain in the body. It's telling you that there's something amiss. So the first question I'd ask if I were involved with a company is it going to be fun? Now I tell you, it's also fun because you never know when you're working with early stage companies what something's going to become. I remember back when Glenn and I were working at PLG, one of our then senior associates came to me and he said, hey, I've got these two grad students down at Stanford. And would you spend a little time with them and see if their hobby might be able to be made into a business? And I said, sure, no problem. So we got together in one of our conference rooms, and these two guys come in. They were both about 25, and they show up, and I say, well, what do you do? And they say, well, you know, there's this new thing called the internet, and we like to play with it. We're bored with our PhD dissertations, and we kind of surf the net. And whenever we find something interesting, we post a link on a website, and that's kind of what we do when we're bored on our dissertation. I say, well, that's great. Is this like the yellow pages of the World Wide Web? And they said, nah, you know, it's too complex for that. We just surf around and we find something interesting, we post it, but it's not complete. We can't surf the whole web. I said, well, is there anything proprietary in what you're doing? They said, nah, you know, everything is on the website. There's a guy down in Sunnyvale, every time we post a link on our site, he posts a link on his site. You know, there's nothing proprietary. I said, well, is there any money in this business? Nah, the web's really all about free. So I'm sitting there saying, oh, this sounds great. You know? Not proprietary, incomplete, no money. Yeah, let's go for it. But they said, yeah, but we got this really interesting name for this business. You know, we were calling it Jerry's Guide to the World Wide Web, but we think we're going to call it Yahoo. It's yet another hierarchical, officious oracle. And I said, well, that sounds kind of cool, I guess. But I have to admit, you know, part of the fun of working with startups, and I'm sure everybody in this room feels the same way, is that you never know where the path you're on is going to lead. And a lot of times, you know, the path that you're on is not just creating success for you and the entrepreneurs, but is actually doing something really important for our society. And I think that as Glenn mentioned, I'm an old Peace Corps volunteer, and it makes a big difference to me that I'm not just doing something for profit, but I'm actually helping people. In fact, I've started 2 of the medical device companies I've helped to start. I actually benefited personally. I've had 2 major operations in my life, and each time one of those companies ended up making the device that helped me, and they turned out to be huge successes. Anyway, you know what I'm doing now. You know, I'm no longer a lawyer. I went inactive with the state bar in 2005, and I do seed investing. And the theme of my talk was extreme VC. But I'm really going to talk more about investing principles, but just a word about what I do now. We basically, at Concept Company, I have a partner, and we basically try to find professors or other people with interesting technology that don't want to quit their day jobs. And we try to be their business partner in helping to, you know, recruit a management team, define the business plan, you know, find financing, find advisors, find board members, and we work almost entirely for equity compensation. And the way I would say it is it takes a lot longer to do it this way, but you can end up with something significant. The first company I did in this model was another company I worked with at BLG that's now an Ori Carrington client, Financial Engines. And 2 Stanford professors came to me and said that maybe they want to start something, but they didn't have a clue. It's just that one of the professors had won the Nobel Prize in economics and was spending all of his time basically developing software for 20 graduate students, teaching a graduate student course. And his friend, the other professor, said, well, maybe there'd be some better way to make use of your life's work than just teaching 20 students per year. And maybe we could start a company around your life's work. But everything was in his textbook. There was nothing proprietary. And so the journey began. But now the company is closing in on $1 billion valuation and doing and 11 years later, you know, it's been very successful. But that's kind of the fun of it. You know, you start and you don't know where the path is going to go. But in terms of how you do it, that's what I wanted to talk about today. Because, I mean, again, people in this room, probably many people here are more qualified to talk than I am about how you invest in Hawaii. But I think I can give you some of the principles that have worked for me in terms of early stage seed investing that I pay attention to and I think are generally applicable even to investments here. And by the way, I'd also point out that when Glenn says that we were at BLG, we were revolutionary in going away from coats and ties to less formal dress. I was just copying Hawaii, you know. You were way ahead of us. But anyway, you know, what I would say the top principles I would identify as being things that I watch for, and this isn't necessarily in the order that I weight them, But the first one, frankly, is character. Character counts. Another way to say it is integrity. If I have the slightest doubt about the integrity of the founders, or any of them, I won't get involved. Life is just too short. So, and that's important. It means, for instance, that it really helps if you have some kind of pre-existing relationship with the entrepreneur or some link of personal trust that validates that you're dealing with good people. And I've had a number of cases where that hasn't been the case, and in each case, a lot of time and energy was invested and frankly didn't come to anything. In one case, I remember I was investor counsel for Kleiner Perkins in one case and Sequoia in another case, and they were both investing in different companies in Europe. And that's a long way away in different cultures, and in each case, the companies had been started with debt financing, so the owners owned about 80% of the company individually, and Kleiner was buying in, Sequoia was buying in. But something just didn't feel right to me. The entrepreneurs came over, but I just didn't feel that they were being completely honest. And I told the venture capitalists, I said, look, I'm investor counsel. I don't know that much about, it's hard for me to do due diligence on these companies half a world away. But something doesn't seem right to me. Something just doesn't seem right. But they went ahead and did the deal. Everything worked out on paper. But when the companies finally came down to getting ready to go public, in both cases, it turned out that both kinds of companies had been keeping two sets of books. One for the investors and one for the government. And when the auditors went in to prepare audited financial statements for the companies, guess what? The companies that were supposedly quite profitable were actually running major losses. And so the public offering wasn't going to happen. And it just, we forget, I think, in this country, how much we rely upon social conventions and social trust, the basic honesty of everyone. Because no matter how good a lawyer you are, you can't protect against dishonest people. I look very carefully when I get involved with a company about whether I think I can trust these people, because if you're an active investor, as I've typically been, it's like a marriage. You're getting involved with people often for a long period of time, and why do it if you can't completely trust them? The second principle that I keep in mind when thinking about investing in a company is alignment of interests. It's amazing how many people get this wrong, but you want as an investor to be in the same boat as the entrepreneur. And if you're not in the same boat exactly in the center line, at least you want to be in the same boat where you're sitting on the left side of the rowboat and they're sitting on the right side. You want to be at least in the same boat. One of you can't be off there in the water, and this comes up in many cases because people forget that back in the early days of Silicon Valley, and I'm not that old, I don't go back to the 60s, but I do know that back in the 60s there was no such thing as preferred stock. Everybody, invested in common stock. The employees got common stock, the investors got common stock, everybody got common stock without all kinds of fancy rights and privileges. And it worked out okay. Some pretty successful companies were started back then. But I think, the reason for aligning interests is that unexpected things will happen. And you have to make sure that the investors and the entrepreneurs will react to them the same way. I've worked with a couple of companies that have been funded by private equity firms and late stage hedge funds, and they have a very different mentality. They have a very much I win, you lose mentality, and I think that's very countercultural to me because they're kind of waiting to pounce. They build in all kinds of, they give you a high valuation, but they're putting in all these terms, and if something goes wrong, it's almost like you can see them saying, whoopee, we're getting it. But that's not the way I think, and you have to make sure that your interests are aligned. The classic story, in my experience, I wasn't directly involved in this, was the story of VisiCorp, which some of you may remember was one of the early software success stories in Silicon Valley back in the 80s. Two Harvard Business School students were watching a professor do calculations on the blackboard just after the Apple II had come out. And they were saying, boy, that guy is really working hard, erasing this and erasing that and recalculating this. Couldn't we do a little Apple II program and do that and make that automated? And that became VisiCalc, which was the first major success for the Apple. And it was the first spreadsheet. But those two engineers then decided that they would, one wanted to live on the West Coast, one wanted to live on the East Coast. And the guy on the East Coast was the engineer, and he decided to start a company, Software Arts, that would basically do the development work. And the West Coast company, started by Dan Flaustra, was going to do the marketing of his account and pay a 50% royalty to the East Coast company. And classic misalignment of interests, because what happened was that the company was an enormous success. Visit Corp, which was the company on the West Coast, had rocketing sales, was paying 50% of its revenues as royalties to this engineering company on the East Coast. But the East Coast company started to think, well, wait a minute, I'm only getting 50% of the sales. Why don't I develop a product where I can get 100% of the sales? And so the East Coast company spent all its time developing a little tiny dinky product called TK Solver that had no market whatsoever. And in the meantime, the West Coast company that didn't have any or very many engineers watched as IBM introduced the PC, and of course then there was the opportunity to do a spreadsheet for the PC, but the two companies were fighting among themselves, and the East Coast company didn't want to do it, and the next thing you knew, one of the engineers at the West Coast company got so fed up that he left. That was Mitch Kapoor, and he went and started Lotus 123. And you know, I mean, and both companies, both VisiCorp and Software Arts, fought, spent lots of money on lawyers, totally misaligned interests. Both of them ended up going insolvent with no financial return whatsoever to the founders or investors. And the real winners were people like Mitch Kapoor and Lotus, which took it the next generation. You really have to make sure as an investor that your interests are aligned because things will happen that you don't expect, and you want to be able to be in the same boat. Also, another factor that I look at as an investor, my third factor, is to try to find a way, I call it must be present to win. That means, you know, I have a very simple philosophy in starting a company, and that is if you have intelligent, honest people who listen to customers and they stay alive, their chances of success approach 100%. Well, because if they listen, even if they're wrong the first time or the second time, but if they can stay alive, they're going to iterate and change and then eventually find the sweet spot where they can win. And that's why many times, and especially in a market that's a newer technology market like Hawaii, many businesses that ultimately become product companies start out as service companies. You know, for instance, a lot of times companies might start out as consulting businesses because, you know, if you've got an expertise to sell, you can consult and make a living, but then gradually you productize your business and make it into a success. Again, you know, find a way to survive. And I try to understand whether the model is going to be one which is going to be heavily investor dependent. And I don't like those companies. I think it's like being addicted to heroin. I mean, some companies take a lot of money to get started, but I much prefer the companies that find a way to live and learn on someone else's nickel other than the investors. I don't like dilution. And that's really pretty much the same as my fourth principle, which is you have to adapt or die. Because companies which do find a way to stay alive have to listen to customers and be willing to change their business models depending on you know, what they learn in the marketplace. You know, I've had a hobby for years of collecting corporate names that ended up having nothing to do with what the corporation ended up doing. You know, and it's just kind of fun because it indicates how organic this process is. You know, so one of my star clients in my early days was a company called Biomation. And I thought Biomation was a great name. I mean, a kind of automation and biology put together. And that's kind of what it was at the beginning, but because they were in import-export business in Silicon Valley, importing medical diagnostic equipment from a British company in the early days of semiconductor memory chips. But in those days, the semiconductor chips were totally flaky. And so about every other instrument that arrived from this English company didn't work. So the founder basically had to find some way to diagnose these pieces of equipment. So he ended up inventing some lab instruments called a digital waveform recorder and a logic analyzer that hadn't existed before to try to find out if these machines worked. And customers started coming in and saying, well, I don't have any interest in your medical instrument, but sell me one of those lab instruments, that looks interesting. And in a couple of years, this company became the leading manufacturer of digital logic analyzers and waveform recorders, and was sold for a then very astronomical sum to a large Midwest company. But it kept the name Biomation. And I just think, again, you just have to adapt or die. Another company I worked with was a company called Novacept in the medical area. And that was an interesting company because it went through 3 different separate incarnations, the same company. It started out as a medical device company making endoscopy tools for knuckle surgery, and ended up, after multiple iterations, becoming a device for women endometrial ablation, kind of a whole different part of the body, a whole different sex. But this company managed to go through 3 different transformations without diluting its initial investors too much, being very economical, and ended up selling itself to Johnson & Johnson for $300 million. But this company, over 10 years, was 3 entirely different companies. They just kind of reinvented themselves, stayed alive, and succeeded. So you have to be willing to be flexible. Don't be rigid. Listen to your customers, and if you can't succeed one way, go another way. The 5th principle I use that I look for is whether there's too much ego in the business, from the founder's point of view, because sometimes people start companies because it's an ego trip. I really want to make sure that when I get involved, that the founders are going to be flexible in their roles, so that the person who's the CEO to begin with is willing to step into a different role, for instance, if that's what's good for the business. So I try to find out, for instance, a danger sign for me is if the management team comes to me and the first thing they ask about is, they're all asking about negotiating their employment contracts. I say, well, that's kind of the wrong thing to say, because that kind of implies that you think you're going to get fired. And that doesn't indicate to me as an investor, as a potential investor, a lot about ringing confidence that you're going to just succeed. So if I sense that management is entrenching itself and not really flexible and willing to take advice, I stay away. I mean, that's a major problem. I also look for people. My 6th principle is looking for people that are in it for the long term. Who are doing it other than for quick financial gain. Because in my experience, there has often been a mismatch between the traditional venture capital model and the way companies really grow. Venture capital funds are highly incentive to get into a company, grow the company, and get out. And typically they advertise to their limited partners that they can do this in 3 to 5 years. And I think that's just total nonsense. I mean, it does happen, but I think companies take a lot longer in most cases to organically grow, develop a management team, find their bliss, develop an institution. And venture capitalists love them to death, but sometimes they can just push way too hard for early liquidity. It's like kind of trying to raise an apple orchard and you harvest the saplings. I mean, let them grow, let them grow. One of my favorite quotes was from Bill Hewlett of Hewlett-Packard, and he was interviewed by the San Jose Mercury News in the late 80s on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Hewlett-Packard, and I think the reporter asked him what it felt like to be the co-founder of Silicon Valley's first rocket ship. And he looked at the reporter and he said, rocket ship? It's taken us 50 years to get to where we are today. 50 years is a long time. He said, many years our sales went down, not up. And you forget, that if you're going to build something truly great, it can take time, and you have to have the patience to see it out. I mean, Financial Engines, I mentioned earlier, the Nobel Prize winner, we're into our 11th year with that company, and we're still private. And we're only now starting to really hit that ramp that people have been waiting for. You have to. On the other hand, I say to myself, well, if it's 15 years per company, you have to kind of do the math. And I keep saying, well, I've got a few more cycles, I hope, in me, but that's a long time. But anyway, you've got to be patient. You've got to be patient. I also look for companies that focus on profitability. Because one of the best investors I ever knew, Jack Milcor, always told his companies that profitability was a state of mind. It was kind of like a decision you make. It's not, Because you know, what profitability really is it's just another word for having to make decisions, to make trade-offs. You know, because you know, if you don't ever have to make trade-offs, then you don't learn the discipline that you'll need as a larger company. Because even when you're small, but also when you're large, even IBM has to make decisions and set priorities, and it doesn't have infinite resources. And you have to start out from the beginning where the goal is to be profitable. And a lot of entrepreneurs make the mistake of thinking that, oh my God, we're in this market, we've got to grow quickly, grow big or go home, you know, that kind of thing. But I hate that. I say, no. You know, I'll take slower growth and control over my destiny. I'd rather you get profitable, and then we'll talk about growth. Because you know, I'd rather have people think that they control their destiny and they got all the time in the world and they're going to win. And that's what comes from profitability. I worked with a company, a semiconductor company early in my career called Zilog that had the great misfortune. It was some of the most creative engineers in Silicon Valley's history. It was a team that spun out of Intel, and they came up with the Z80 microprocessor, Federico Faggin, Ralph Ugerman. Unbelievable talent, but they made the great strategic mistake of taking money, making it as their only investor an oil company. And that was a disaster, because the oil company basically came to them and said, yeah, you know, you need money, you know, we'll just drill another well, you know, here's some more money. And they never imposed on the company the need to make choices. They kind of told the management that they could do everything. But as the company grew like crazy, it never developed the discipline, and it never could get its operations profitable. And eventually, you know, the larger company, Exxon, just smothered them, and I mean, they still were a success, but nothing like they should be where Intel is today. But it was purely the mistake of going with somebody that told them that money didn't matter, spend as much as possible. I think that corrupts companies just like it corrupts kids, and so so I think profitability is important. I also look for companies that try to eliminate risk early, because if you think about it as an investor, the name of the game is to eliminate as much risk as possible, as quickly as possible, with as little money as possible. And Tom Perkins of Kleiner Perkins used to tell the story of how he started Tandem Computers. And he went to the best software engineer in Hewlett Packard that he knew, and he said, could you build a nonstop fail-safe computer? And the software engineer said, well, I can do the software, but the hardware would be impossible. And so he went to the best hardware engineer he knew at Hewlett Packard and said, well, what about you? Could you do it? He said, yeah, I can do the hardware, but you can never get anybody to do the software. So that's when he knew that, you know, with $50,000 worth of consulting costs, he knew he could build Tandem. And you want to find a way to eliminate risk early. The flip side of that is I've worked personally with several companies where after anywhere between $100 million and $600 million worth of investment, they still hadn't eliminated technical risk and had proven that they could make the products work. And that's a real downer. I mean, you know, because one company was TerraStore, started by a team that had started $2 billion disk drive companies, and they were out to start their third. But, you know, and they had the idea of using Winchester disk drive technology with a laser beam focused to two lenses to an ultra small point on a disk drive, and ultra terabyte type storage and small disk drives. The only problem was that after $100 million worth of investment, they were still boiling the surface off the disk with this ultra hot laser beam, and all the little fumes were going up and coating the lens, so the disk drive would basically last for about 2 hours, then they would stop working. And they had little fans that they were building in to try to blow things away, and you know. But after $100 million, people said, well, we don't know how much more money we'd have to spend to make this work. I worked with another company at DLG initially called Silicon Video, later Condescent, that took $600 million of capital to try to make thin tube CRTs. And again, total wipeout. After 15 years of work, the company sold its assets for $10 million. You know, you just hate to be in a situation where you're putting that kind of money down and you haven't eliminated the risk. And you know. And there's technology risk, management risk, marketing risk, but if you can eliminate risk early, your chances of success are a lot higher. My eighth principle is that I tend to be of the Don Valentine, Mike Moritz school of thought when it comes to companies. And this is an ideological debate within Silicon Valley. Do people matter more or do markets matter more? Well, I tend to be on the side that markets matter more, because, but a lot of people believe that people matter more. But I think that, if you find a couple of raggedy entrepreneurs with a product that people are ripping out of their hands, and a good example was the Apple I, when Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak went down to the homebrew computer club with Apple I circuit boards, and people were buying them at $500 a piece as fast as they could put them together. Or the Cisco founders, Leonard Bosak and Sandra Lerner, two administrators at Stanford University, trying to find a way to put a network together between the business school and the computer science department, were constructing router boards in their living room in Atherton and selling them as fast as they could do it. That indicates that you've got a great market where people want the products. Maybe not have the greatest managers, but you've got a great market, and that's how you get the Cisco's and the Yahoo's and the Google's and the Apple's. Great markets, and oftentimes the people that were the initial managers aren't the ones that last that long, but they get it started. But what you're looking for is the great market. So I tend to look for markets. What I don't want to have is a great team that's looking for a market, because that's what I kind of call like the jet engine in a Model T body. And by that I mean I've had companies where you couldn't beat the management team, and they had great technology, but they weren't quite sure what they were going to sell. And and that kind of a situation is enormously frustrating, because then you have like these whiz kids that can do anything, but they don't know what to do, but they're going to do it really well. And so I'd rather start out with two kids in Silicon Valley like Jerry Yang and Dave Filo of Yahoo, who have stumbled across something. And the one thing that Yahoo had going for it when I was talking with them was the fact that there were lots of hits happening on the website. They had, like, at that time, back in 1994, about 200,000 hits a day, and that was pretty good back in those days when you didn't have Netscape, you had a Mosaic as your browser if you had it at all. And the way I think, if you're a really good venture capitalist, I look at it like you're a predator on the plains of the Serengeti. No, I mean, I don't mean, if you're entrepreneurs in the crowd, I don't mean to make you feel like you're a Thompson's gazelle or something. Cute little Bambi out there. Barry and Bill are waiting to pounce on you with fangs. But the really great venture capitalists, in my opinion, have amazing peripheral vision. And I would say that, just like great predators, they can spot motion on the fringes of their field of vision. Now, they don't have a clue, in many cases, what that motion means, but they can spot motion. I mean, a good example was Yahoo. I mean, I asked Mike Barretz, who invested in Yahoo. He put it, when we brought Yahoo to Sequoia or whatever, they put in $1 million for 25% of the company, because nobody, including us, had any idea how they could have, to me it wasn't clear that there wouldn't be 60,000 pairs of grad students around the country collecting websites. What was so difficult about collecting websites and putting links on your website? I mean, that wasn't rocket science. But the one thing that Barretz could see was he could see motion out there at the edge of his peripheral vision. Something was happening. He didn't quite know what it was. We didn't either. But we went ahead at Venture Law Group and accepted them as a client, and at a time when we were turning a lot of companies down, and we could see motion too, but we didn't know what it would become, but we could see motion. And I just think you have to be on the lookout for things you don't understand. I would give a flip side, without naming names. We had a former partner at VLG who had the opposite idea, that he would only approve investments. He was the head of our investment committee for a brief while. He would only approve investments that he understood. That was a complete disaster. Because he would try. He was summa cum laude from Princeton. He was a hell of a smart guy, but he just thought that if he couldn't understand it, we shouldn't invest in it. And that was bad news. Because the most successful investments that I've done over myself over the years have been ones where I didn't have a clue. And that goes to my next to last point, which is that luck does count in this game. Look, I've been doing this for 30 years as a lawyer and as an investor, and I've had some good luck, and I've had a lot of failed investments. But the truth is that there's a lot of luck in this game because you can't tell exactly what you get into, and that means that, for instance, if you're really in this game as an angel investor, you do need to have the philosophy of a diversified portfolio because you can't tell. I mean, one of the reasons VLG's investment portfolio did well was because we were like a mutual fund. I mean, we had a little bit of stock in a large number of companies, but we were not good, even though we were the counsel for the companies, at guessing which ones were going to be successful. And I think you've got to keep in mind, if you're going to play this game, that you, as an investor, that you've got to have enough variety in your portfolio so that you can start to take advantage of the law of large numbers. My brother's a doctor, and doctors have a hard time these days with all the problems of the medical system and healthcare reimbursement. So I was trying to put together a trust for his kids' college education, and I said, look, pick 4 startups. I gave him a list of a bunch of startups that I worked with, and I said, pick 4 of these, and I'll be able to get you a small investment in each one of these, and maybe some of them will be worth something someday. So he went through it, and I talked to him about it, and he picked 4. And he asked me to rank order those companies in all my experience of how well they would work out. And 10 years later, the one I thought was a complete no-lose situation. I mean, a mortal lock on becoming a huge company. Went bankrupt in 3 years. But the little oddball company that he picked that I thought had about a 1 in 10,000 chance of making it ended up being sold to Qualcomm for $1 billion. And so I mean, you just don't know. But the main thing is that, so if I can't do it, I guarantee you can't do it. But I do think that basically you have to have enough skin in the game, enough pieces, enough horses in the race, or whatever. At least a couple of them will cross the finish line. The last point that I look for in investing is what I call do it right or don't do it at all. And this goes to the issue of getting the right advisors, the right legal counsel. This is only in a small way a commercial for Greg Kim and Vantage Legal Counsel and Glenn Van Lichten and Ori Carrington and Sutcliffe. But it is true that I think that if you're going to get involved with a company, make sure that it has experienced legal counsel. I know when I'm a investor in a company, that's one of the first things I look for, because in a way you kind of look at the law firm as an insurance policy. I mean, I want legal opinions. I don't know, Bill, you look uncomfortable there. I don't mean that you have to be an insurance agent, but no, I look at it and I say that these, if I have a really good law firm involved with the company, at least I have a pretty good sense that there aren't any really, ticking time bombs, or there's some, oh, by the way, disclosure item that I didn't know about or something. So I have a good sense that I'm getting what I think I'm getting, and I'm also getting, if the company has the right law firm and the right advisor, I know that the entrepreneurs are not just getting good legal help, but hopefully good business counseling, good neutral advice, not pro-investor, not pro-entrepreneur, neutral advice. And so that's really important. I also look very carefully at their willingness to take advice and get other entrepreneurs involved as board members or advisors, because it's kind of lonely if you're starting a company and you don't have much experience. One of the easiest things to do is people are so generous with their time to get the right advisors, possibly as seed investors, as advisors, as board members. So I put a lot of emphasis on getting the right people involved with a company at the beginning, and sometimes that's part of the value that I can add as an investor. I know somebody that I can kind of talk into getting involved, and that can really increase the chances of success. But anyway, those are the 10 of the investment principles that I tend to use when I look at early stage investing, and some work out and some don't. But as I said at the beginning, if you're having fun, then you're on the right track. And with that, I think I'd stop and ask Greg asked if I would take a few minutes of questions. We started a little bit later, so I'll just keep this short, but if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yeah.
Mr. Johnson, thanks for coming today. This is really great. So Warren Buffett is the greatest investor in the history of the stock market, and his number one rule of investing is only invest in what you understand. The question is somewhere around point 9. Now, it's completely counter to your sort of philosophy. My question is, do you think there's enough of a discrepancy in how you look at private equity deals and how you invest in publicly traded companies that both philosophies are actually correct in their respective?
Yeah, I think, it's really two completely different types of investing. I mean, Warren Buffett basically looks at macro trends, Coca-Cola, McDonald's. I mean, he's looking at big picture demographic trends, and if he's identified a big picture trend, he's willing to bet on it and bet on it over a long period of time, and he's doing it with stable companies, with liquidity. When you're, that's absolutely a great way to invest, because, if you're deploying billions of dollars per investment, you goddamn better know what you're doing and understand your strategy. But when you're starting with an early stage investment, I'm not saying, I mean, you want a great team, you want to know that you can trust them, you want to have a sense of the market and so forth. But I'd say that sometimes, at least in the technology field, innovation comes from nowhere. And part of the fun of being a technology lawyer is you never know if the two people in front of your desk are going to be the next two founders of a Yahoo or a Google or a PayPal. You just don't know. And you learn to be very humble in that process, because, even if you've had a lot of experience, you just don't know. But if they seem to meet the other criteria, and if you can sense that there's something happening, more often than not, you take a chance. And sometimes it doesn't work out, but more often than not, it does. And when I've gotten involved with companies, though, I don't take it as kind of a lottery approach or just throw something in. I mean, my theory was I'll get involved and really be their partner, work on the deal. But at the beginning, I'll be learning, because it often is something completely new to me. I mean, and you just have to be adaptable. I mean, PayPal was a great example. When we started that company, we didn't, I was the lawyer for a fellow named Elon Musk, who now is launching rockets into space and all this, but with SpaceX. But, his vision initially was to create a full-service online bank. I mean, we actually acquired a bank and a banking charter, federal banking charter. We were going to offer mutual funds and all kinds of banking features online. And oh, by the way, we were also going to do micropayment transfers. And then there was another company 2 blocks away on University Avenue in Palo Alto called Confinity that was doing micropayment transfers as well. So the investors decided to combine the companies in a 50-50 merger, but quickly it became clear that 98% of what we were trying to do was just nonsense, and we just threw away the 98% and kept the little micropayments part, the micropayments transfer. All I can say is that at the beginning of a company like this, you really can't expect that you know what's going to happen. You just have to be nimble, you have to listen to the marketplace, and you have to be ready to change strategies on a dime. And that's a little different than Warren Buffett, because Warren Buffett bets on long-term trends, and so he's not expecting Coca-Cola to reinvent itself the next day. So, or more questions? I can't have answered everything that you wanted to know about investing.
Can you speak
Yes.
to the seed versus the next stage? How do you distinguish the seed investment by study?
Well, if you're a seed investor, it's a very dangerous place to be. It's because most seed investors don't have the capital to make follow-on investments and play with the big boys. And so you run the risk of doing a lot of the pioneering work and then not getting rewarded for the risk you took, even with your successes, because the big money comes along and then basically dilutes you out to a large extent, and you don't get rewarded for the risk you took. I think it's hard. Seed investing is great if you have a sense that the company can be capital efficient. Like what I do, with Concept of Company, is we look for capital efficient ventures that can get profitable some way. Product sales, consulting, whatever, relatively quickly, because then you're not at the mercy of the next round of financing, because otherwise if you really need the money and you don't have the money, you have to take what you can get. So I think, seed versus the first round is great, and many companies need that money, But I like to try to find a way so that the company can get that financing on its own terms and not be at the mercy of people that would extract terms that were unfair to the entrepreneurs and to the seed investors. So in other words, I think you have to be very careful as a seed investor not to have your head handed to you in later rounds. Yes?
How'd you guys go about establishing a valuation for Yahoo? And you know, when you see a startup like that that's just so novel, it's like, what the hell is this? But it looks like it might have potential. You know, how do you go about valuing that?
It's just total guesswork. I mean,
That's the scientific explanation.
well, there was no revenue involved, so there's no way to use a conventional metric for valuing a company. I mean, Yahoo had no revenue at the beginning, so how do you value it? Actually, in most cases, you know, the way you get to valuations of companies is you kind of, the way I do it, it doesn't have anything to do with dollars at all. It tends to be what is the appropriate percentage ownership for each set of stakeholders in a company. So for instance, you know, you have a certain amount in mind for the founders and the entrepreneurs. You have a certain amount of stock in mind for the future employees and the employee pool. You have a certain amount of stock in mind that you know, like a major investor like Sequoia, Kleiner, Menlo Ventures, others, will generally require at least 20% ownership of a company to spend partner time on the company. So you kind of start filling in the blanks, and then when you finish with your ownership allocation, you then decide how much money you need. Because a lot of times the venture capital funds are not sensitive about how much money they invest. I mean, it's oxymoronic, but it's actually true that valuation and that percentage ownership and the amount of money being invested are actually occupy different parts of the venture capitalist brain. Venture capitalists start out thinking how much they have to own of the company, and then they figure out how much money they will invest, but they're not directly related. I've had situations where we've agreed with the lead venture fund that they'll get 22% of the company for X million dollars, and then they'll come to me later and say, Craig, would you take a little more money? No more dilution, but would you take a little more money? And you say, why would they give us more money for the same percentage? And the reason is very simple. These guys are managing huge pools of capital and have to get it out there. So once they've got the amount of ownership that they want to reduce the risk of being embarrassed by having to go back to their partners too early for more capital. And they also want to get that money to work because they have to get it placed somehow, and they only have a limited amount of partner hours. So I've actually had, it seems like it's a bizarre industry, but you'll get people saying, well, look, that's a great deal, Craig, that's fine, we'll do it, but how about we put 10 million in instead of 5 million in on the same terms? If I didn't say yes to that, or if the entrepreneurs didn't say yes to that, they would have to be committed. They would fail the intelligence test. But it is true that that people think of it in different ways, and it's funny how they don't put them together. I mean, entrepreneurs think logically, well, I don't want to give up that much of the company, I'll basically say that you can invest half and I'll give up half the ownership. But that doesn't work. That's not how they think. They want their ownership. So the valuation is usually a factor of stakeholder percentages, and then you kind of throw in the money later. Maybe one more question and then we'll go on. Yes?
How do you see the future of Silicon Valley with respect to innovation, entrepreneurship, and venture capital?
Well, I'm pretty much, I think that I'm pretty optimistic. I think that I don't think there's a better place. This is good news for Hawaii because, Hawaii and Silicon Valley are pretty close together. I think Silicon Valley is still the place in the world where industries are born. I mean, whether it be semiconductors, internet, biotech, telecommunications, routers, semiconductors, it's still the most logical place. In fact, I can't name any major technology industry that hasn't been started in Silicon Valley. Maybe there is one, but I mean, it's still a pretty remarkable record that the Googles and the others are, that each wave of innovation seems still to be primarily based in Silicon Valley. Now we have clean tech, and clean tech actually is taking Silicon Valley by storm. I mean, it's really interesting. Again, this is an area that I think will be highly relevant to Hawaii because with Hawaii's strong biology base and its strong environmental base, but clean tech is real now. I mean, it is big time in Silicon Valley, big money. In fact, one of our former partners, Josh Green at DLG, is now a full partner at Moore Davidow Ventures, and he's their clean tech guy. Now that might be a sign of the top, that we've reached the top of the cycle, but nonetheless, when a lawyer becomes the clean tech guy. But on the other hand, I think it's real. I mean, I'm personally looking, clean tech is going after multi-billion-dollar markets. And I'll tell you an example for me of why, clean tech is real. I know a friend of mine is a guy named Jim Morgan, who's chairman of Applied Materials, and I was talking to him the other day. And Applied is now making production equipment. They're I don't know how big a company, $10, $20 billion company, making production equipment for semiconductor manufacturer. But now they're making production equipment for solar cell manufacturer. That indicates that that this is real. This is getting big, and so that's yet another industry which again, there's no monopoly in Silicon Valley, but there's just a critical mass of ingenuity and creativity and risk taking that exists there. But I think one of the great things about what you've got going here is that there's a direct symbiosis and exchange of some of that DNA between Silicon Valley and Hawaii. I mean, I'm here, Glenn's here. My good friend and office mate John Dean, former chairman and CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, has been working now as seed venture capitalist, has been very active trying to help entrepreneurship, working with Barry and Bill and others. I mean, there's a lot of DNA being exchanged between Silicon Valley and Hawaii, and I think, I think frankly this place, what you're doing, Michael, is an example. I mean, it's just fascinating what's going on right now in Hawaii, and Hawaii is so well situated as kind of the crossroads of China and Silicon Valley and the mainland. Dragon Bridge, I mean, you're really on the cusp of the future. So I would love to see the enthusiasm in this room. I think you're going to have a tremendous amount of success. Leverage the relationships with Silicon Valley as much as you can. Take advantage of it. Invite us over. We like to come over. It's good weather. And I think you're just going to have continued success. And I've seen amazing developments here in the last 10 years, and I think you're going to have a great future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. That was great. I remember about 10 years ago, Craig came out and gave a talk to some lawyers, and I was really shocked because we had about 100 signups. And this was at a time when they said lawyers are really awful here, we couldn't do these deals. And Craig at that time told me about the Yahoo case, and he said, yeah, if you have a client that you don't understand what they do, pay attention to them. So I'm happy to report that I don't know what any of our clients do, so I should have some success, I guess. But I'd like to thank Craig for coming. We have a small token of appreciation. Craig's coming out here on his own and contributed his time. And if we pull this thing off, I really feel like Craig had a big part to do with it, because I think the lawyers have gotten better, the company has gotten better, ventures getting better, and I'd like to continue Craig's involvement in what we're doing here. So we have a small Coke bowl to thank you, and thank you so much. So we'll take a quick break now, 5 or 10 minutes max, please, and then we'll move to the next room and set up for the first of the 3 exciting panels we have for you this afternoon. So if you're a panel member, please meet us on the other side. Thank you.